this is actually a souped up version of the unit I was teaching my 7th graders when Renat asked me to do this. So that's kind of how we got here. How did we get here? This is a brief and partial history of race. Okay, so we have a president right now that claims he's not racist, but engages in dog whistle politics, racist commentary, and has a history of discriminatory housing practices. I'm the least racist person.
Oh, you did that.
Right. Black people often have to interact with police because activities we engage in scare and unsettle white people. We are out of place and to police often dangerous. That's Barbecue Betty, who called the police on a bunch of people at Lake Merritt because they were having a barbecue. That was a girl who fell asleep in her dorm. Okay, so as Black Lives Matter took off, we had to hear a lot about All Lives Matter. The analogy being we equated Black Lives Matter to a burning house needing more water. We were told all houses need water. And despite the fact that we were on fire, that didn't make our needs more pressing. People say the system is broken, but I'm pretty sure it's working just fine. So how did we get here? So it turns out size really does matter. When Europe expanded and grabbed and conquered, it was largely because their countries were small. Power and size are very much intertwined. So to justify bad behavior, moral justification helps big time. Uncivilized behavior was because you don't look like us, no smallpox, no fences, no greed or churches, and you must be a savage, and therefore you can't have what used to be yours, an imposed hierarchy, and so it begins. Seconds is a long time. So we're going to move from Native Americans into Black people. Okay, so Anthony Johnson and Elizabeth Key were 2 Africans brought as slaves in the early 1600s. This is prior to chattel slavery. So they both obtained their freedom, they flourished, and in the 1600s, as a result, new laws were introduced that changed slavery and made it something else. As a result, Johnson's son could not inherit his own land because he was an alien. So this is a slide about a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. He was a wealthy white property owner. He got indentured servants and black slaves to fight with him. They burned down Jamestown, freaked out the white property owners, and as a result, they made slavery like an inherited disorder, which is really all about the Benjamins. We needed a free labor force to build our country on. It's what made America great, so we needed it to be a permanent situation. Then a bunch of European scientists got into it. The whole Enlightenment thing happened. Everybody's a human. Oh, wait, not really. Let's categorize everybody's skull size. Let's put them in races. Caucasians are awesome. So it's hard to think about, but I wonder sometimes what would it mean if racism didn't exist, if we started over again, if we didn't categorize ourselves, if we didn't create a hierarchy. Is it even like a possibility, or do humans always do that to themselves? And it's not enough to just celebrate Martin Luther King Day and whitewash his past, which was actually kind of dicey, and then say it's all good because I know he was a hero. It's not quite enough. There's more we need to do. It's not really enough to exist in our own bubble. I'm a liberal. I live in San Francisco. I treat everybody equally. That's not enough to erase our racist situation. It's got to be more active than that. It can't just be everything's okay. So it's important to think about privilege. It's important to think about what everybody's race is like that they have to run. And it's really important to remember that our dark, dark legacy does not just go away. And when people say racism is individual acts, it's not really true. That's my family. And my stepmother and my dad, in their first conversation, my stepmother told this whole story about this black parent she had an interaction with, and how she said she was so racist and my stepmother could never talk to her again. And my dad said, what if that was the beginning of the conversation, not the end? Play basketball with people different from yourself, live next to people different from yourselves, and then you can begin to understand that difference is actually a gift, not something we have to be scared of. So this is the truth as I know it. You have to speak your truth, even if it's really scary. Very long. last one? Yeah? So my question to you is, what will you do today?
So at this time, would you like to do Q&A?
Sure, except that this was not a science presentation, so I doubt people probably have those same kind of questions, but I can answer any questions people do have. Do you have any? Yes, Renata.
So the race science thing that you brought up for a minute, can you speak a little bit more to that?
There were a lot of, so the Enlightenment was a period of time in Europe where like people were exploring what it means to be human and everybody's human, but then almost immediately, because at the same time the slave trade was happening and colonization, they had to then separate who was human to make it still okay to be enlightened about people being human. So there were these scientists, Samuel Morton, Carolus Linnaeus, and there was this guy named, his last name was Camper. Between the 3 or 4 of them, they came up with skull size being something that justifies like how smart you are. So like different races have different skull size. There was a whole thing about Caucasians being like the beautiful race, and if you were descended from Caucasians, then you must be like kind of higher than everybody else. And then the other guy was really into the Greeks and how the Greeks were pretty much perfect. And they were white, which is a little sketchy. So, so then by nature of that, if you could show that you had descended from the ancient Greeks, then you were obviously on the right plane. This guy, he's like a modern day white supremacist. No, King is the representative. This guy, Spencer, he picked up a lot of that kind of bad science. The thing I try to teach the kids is that those kind of scientists had an idea, and then they went looking for evidence to support the idea, and they discarded every piece of evidence that didn't fit that idea. And so we spend a lot of time, because we lead into a Nazi unit, and so we spend a lot of time talking about that you can't, that's bad science. Like, you have to have an idea and then accept the evidence that comes in, and these guys, that's not what they did. But what it did for average people, which is also true of the eugenics movement, during the whole Nazi thing, is that when you have a scientist saying something's true, it justifies your own behavior. Oh, I'm not a scientist, but this scientist says it too, so it must be true. So science really can fuel social movements in like really good ways and then really scary ways, because people will like suspend their own intelligence basically in the face of science. So. Yeah?
It's interesting you bring up science, because I was thinking in terms of bad science and how people think about things. I was recently kind of reading about similar topics, and how sort of people used religion in a way to sort of suppress things. And part of it was like when Europeans got to the US, everybody got infected by disease and they didn't understand how that worked. So they saw it as like, oh, God thinks I'm superior and I should have this land.
That was a big one.
Do you think that's kind of a similar sort of motivated reasoning? Like, I want this land, so I'm looking for a bad analysis?
Yeah, I mean, during the Dark Ages in Europe, like, similar things happened. Like, they couldn't explain why. They didn't understand that washing your hands was important, so they were sure people had curses. Like, people who were born with birth defects, it must be God saying that they weren't worthy. Like, totally. I think people are very much willing to defer to any sort of larger authority, be it science, religion, or Donald Trump. Like, it lets you off the hook. You don't have to think for yourself. You can suspend what you kind of, your gut says, like, is probably true, because it's like this bigger authority. That's like what I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen, like, in your experience, have you seen any notable changes, like, in your personal life or in, like, our bubble here
In San Francisco?
Since 2016?
Oh. I mean, I think that San Francisco is this very weird, like, situation. I don't know how you place it in the rest of the world, but it's a very, like, self-congratulatory situation to me, where, like, you have a lot of people who have pushed out a lot of other people who used to live here and feel really good about it, basically. Like, when you gentrify a neighborhood and you're like, oh, I'm making this neighborhood so much better, but, like, you don't think about who you pushed out. So I actually don't love San Francisco. I don't know if I ever did, but I've worked in the city for 14 years, and the changes I've seen just make me really sad. There are less and less people who look like me. There's just less difference, and then the income inequality actually freaks me out, because in my study of history, when income inequality gets too big, like, people just tear down a civilization. So that sometimes I feel like we're living in a place that may be one of the first places that's completely gonna implode because of the choices we've made. You know, like in our neighborhood where our school is, which actually is this neighborhood, there's so much construction and nobody is like paying attention to how much there is. We can't find parking because everybody's like tearing down houses or building condos, and like I just think that nobody wants to talk about race, so I don't even know if race is like coming into this conversation. People don't want to talk about race because it makes them uncomfortable, but in my experience growing up around lots of white people and working with lots of white people, I just kind of force it sometimes, and then, no really, like, I know you're uncomfortable, but this is how I teach my kids, because I teach very rich white kids. And the way I do it is I bulldoze them. I'm like, we're going to talk about it, we're going to bring it up. Some kid in my class the other day said all Indians look alike. We dug right into it. Like, this may be the last chance they are ever going to be around a black person who's going to call them on their shit. They may never have a black teacher again, so I figure that's my job in our school. So I do the same thing with white people. Like, we're all thinking about race, and we're all like holding ideas about race, so let's just talk about it and don't, like, I'd rather have you make a bunch of mistakes with me, and I can actually break into your, like, your heads, not you, like, your headspace, and then maybe, like, get you to pay attention to privilege and stuff like that. If I can wake you up, then that is the change that we need. Like, every white person needs to wake up enough to pay attention to the impact they have, and then people of color need to somehow get into a space where they feel they can have that conversation, and then we can all dig around and then, like, realize that race was a social construct invented to justify bad behavior and to make money, and there actually isn't. Thomas Jefferson tried to say there may never have been a difference to start with, but then we created one by, like, slavery, and it meant it, like, imbibed black people with, like, a lower intelligence. So then we created one, which I don't believe because he was an asshole. So I believe at the heart of it, there's absolutely no difference between us, but we've layered on a bunch of social constructs and feelings and history. But if we can all, like, own that, then maybe we can start to, like, dig back into the pieces of ourselves that really, like, aren't that different. But it involves, like, radical honesty. Yeah.
I have a really hard question.
Great.
Do you think there's a
50
I'm a
policy?
teacher, so we do that.
Okay. Do you think there's, like, any policy that somebody could make that would help improve things? Like, is there anything that could be done that would sort of move us in the right direction?
That's so hard to say. It's like saying, like, if men got pregnant, they would act like gynecological services would be free or something like that, right? Birth control would, like, there'd be a pill for men in a heartbeat, like something like that. The best lesson I can say, and this is not a race situation, but my grandmother is 93 years old. She lives in a small town in Ohio. She is a Christian, so that automatically layered in a bunch of biases against gay people. And she was always talking about how they're going to go to hell, but she competed with this thing about being a Christian. Like, she believed the good pieces about being a Christian. You know, you treat your neighbor well, you do what you can to help people. So this little town in Ohio my grandmother lives in is called Yellow Springs. It's like this little enclave of, like, lesbians and, like, liberals, and it's a college town, and it always has been. And my whole family was brought there when slavery ended by their half-brother because he thought they would be safe in this town because it's, like, kind of a utopian society there. So my grandmother, most of my life, I would tell her to tone it down. She would talk about gay people going to hell. A lesbian family moved in across the street, and they had 2 kids, and one got sick, and my grandmother brought them a chicken. She ended up watching their kids one day, and the next time I came to see her, she was like, oh my God, they're a family. Like, and they have all the same family stuff that I have, right? Like, they fight with each other, you know, they need help, their kids are, you know, like, whatever it was. Like, I turn around, my grandmother's, like, knitting sweaters for the kids. They are literally running in and out of my grandmother's house while she makes them brownies. So to me, I don't know if there's a policy, but that's it. You gotta live next door to each other. You need to, like, see the similarities, and then I'm not sure if we can hold, like, our hatred as much if we could see that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks.
I can take one more question.
So, if we were to assume that language is a form of an abstraction
Sure.
of actually we define ourselves in reality,
Sure.
So, as a person of color, you've inherited a language from Europeans. So can that abstraction support your defining yourself in this terms of race? If it's because if the abstraction has no place for even understanding race, how can we talk about communicate race to people when it's not there, when the abstraction itself hasn't been defined? I know that's a complicated question, but I think that if language is an abstraction, it's basically an ideologue of what we perceive as real.
But I'm not sure that it begins and ends with language.
Well, in order for you to speak about
Yes, but it's not
race.
just speaking, I think, right? I think that there's more than talk. There was more than speaking that got my grandmother past her gay issue, right? Like she lived next to them. So do you think that there is a way to conceptualize race beyond language?
Possibly. And
Like
I
in the
think,
human experience?
I'm just posing this question.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. You asked me a very deep question at bedtime. Yeah, literally, this is bedtime for me. But I have no idea.
That's fair. Yeah.
But it's something I'm going to now have to think about. Yeah.
And at this point, we could corner you another day, perhaps not at bedtime, but we should wrap up officially. So thank you very much.